Even after that dingus Switch came out, Nintendo still tried their hardest to support the 3DS, but since the platform was looked at as old news, every new game that came out after that never had a chance at a fair shake. And it's for that reason why everyone thought it was only a matter of minutes before Nintendo smothered the 3DS with a pillow once and for all so the Switch could get the full spotlight. However, between March and December of 2019, the 3DS still managed to sell 620,000 units, along with 4 million physical games as well. And I know that might not be all that impressive, especially when you consider that those numbers are 73% less than the year before, but you know what? I don't care what anyone says, I still think it's pretty fascinating that this elderly little gaming device is still kicking despite the new kid on the block stealing most of the oatmeal every morning. Or, you know, sales, I guess. I don't know. But the main question this brings up is who the frig's still buying 3DSs with all these other amazing consoles out, and more importantly, why? Well, pour yourself a glass of ordinary cow milk, call your step-pepper out for being a winky all the time, press the subscribe button if you haven't already, and allow me, the world's smelliest two-armed man, Cameron all one word, to tell you why the 3DS is still tearing ass in 2020. Or, you know, to some extent anyway. Alright, so for all you naysayers out there who scoff at the idea of playing a 3DS in 2020, let me tell you something right now. This bad boy is one of the greatest gaming platforms of all time. In fact, it honestly might even be my personal favorite, all things considered. And depending on what kind of games you like, you could even argue that it's the best gaming device out right now. Sure, it might not have games anywhere near as epic as what you could find on the PS4, Xbox One, or even the Nintendo Switch for that matter, but the 3DS's library is still quite impressive in its own right, both in terms of quality and quantity. Most importantly of all, the hardware and software is probably cheaper now than it's ever going to be, now that it's at that point in its life cycle where it's too old to be considered up to date, even though Nintendo's still making them, and it's also too recent to be considered retro. The 3DS in 2020 is kind of like the ninth hour of that really cool dude Steve being at your birthday party when he started puking on your couch. Everyone acknowledges he was a hoot to be around for a while, and he did provide some unforgettable moments, but people are starting to wonder why he's still there. Basically, much like my love, nobody wants a 3DS right now, but as with every other console in history, the twilight years are the perfect time to start getting into collecting, whether you're trying to have a wall full of games that you'll never get around to playing, or you just want to have a great time without spending too much money and have way too much self-respect to hire my ex-wife Chili for one of her world-famous massages with a happy beginning. Chili, if you're watching this, please come home, the kids miss you. And this could mean nothing, but out of all Nintendo's handhelds, the 3DS is the one with the least amount of units sold if you're not counting the Virtual Boy, which of course nobody ever does. And since there's fewer 3DSs out in the wild, it might get a little bit more pricey over time, because unlike everything up until the Game Boy Advance, you can't just emulate 3DS games. Well, alright, you can emulate 3DS games, but I'm sorry, every 3DS emulator I've ever seen just looks miserable to me. If you don't have any problem emulating 3DS games, then more power to you, but I just can't in good conscience say that any of the emulators I've seen are an authentic way to play these kinds of games. And while we're at it, the same thing could be said for the original DS as well. I mean, even Nintendo themselves couldn't pull DS emulation off with the Wii U gamepad as the second screen, so given that the best way to play dual-screen games is on actual DS or 3DS hardware, I think it's gonna make these handhelds a tad more expensive sooner than later. And more specifically with the 3DS, since, you know, it can play original DS games too. So if you plan on playing either of these game libraries at some point, then it might be a good idea to secure yourself a new 3DS while you still can before you can only buy used models with loose hinges. I mean, just look at my new 3DS XL. Sure, the Pikachu design's nice and all, but the bigger screen on the XL models make it inevitable for the hinges to start botching. And you know what, I really don't want to be stuck with this for the rest of my life, but the mistake I made is that I already waited too long to get a regular new 2DS model because the prices are already starting to skyrocket and they're also hard to find. And to make finding one even harder, it doesn't help when the word new's in the friggin' title. And trust me, type in regular new 3DS doesn't help much either. And it's not like I could just go to a store and buy one, since the only available 3DS model at this point's the new 2DS XL, which might deter some people from buying one in 2020 since it can't play games in 3D, and I totally understand that, but to be honest, in my thousands of hours of playtime, I'd probably only use 3D for like 15 minutes at most. And that's combined, by the way. I mean, the 3D doesn't give you a headache or anything, and it is kinda cool, but not having it's definitely not a deal breaker, so if I can't find a reasonably priced new 3DS not XL, then this is gonna have to do for me. Although, to be honest, I'm probably just being dramatic, since I doubt very many people are worried about how their gaming platforms are gonna hold up in 50 years. And if that describes you, then $150 for a new 2DS XL is still a fantastic deal. I know the Switch Lite's only $50 more than a new 2DS XL, and I wouldn't necessarily argue that you're not better off getting a Switch Lite, to be honest. But even though the Switch Lite might not cost that much more, 3DS games are still way cheaper than Switch games. I mean, yeah, there are some really cheap Switch games out there that are pretty solid, don't get me wrong, but the very best games are still $60 new and not much cheaper used, whereas the very best 3DS games are all about $20 right now. And even though some of these games are more on the simplistic side when compared to their high-end Switch counterparts, they're still every bit as fun. And at the risk of getting canceled, I honestly think that A Link Between Worlds is an ass hair better than Breath of the Wild. But even though the Switch's top 10 games might be better than the 3DS's, I think that the 3DS's top 100 games are easily better than the Switch's top 100, or at least right now anyway. And look, I totally agree that quality's definitely more important than quantity, and I'm sure that the Switch has plenty more heavy hitters up its sleeve for the future, but still, the fact is that the 3DS has so many solid games that a lot of gold got overlooked over the years, so even if you played all the most popular games, I'm sure Nintendo's final dedicated handheld still got a lot more to offer you. And on top of all that, most of its library is still cheap enough to where you could easily justify giving it another whirl if you sold your original model off a long time ago. You can lie in the comments and say you did if you want, but I'm pretty sure most people haven't come anywhere close to playing all the best games in the library. I mean, just look at my personal stash of games I'm in the middle of playing or honest to God trying to get to at some point before I die. And this isn't even including my digital collection either. But speaking of digital though, the Switch definitely has better deals as far as that's concerned, but something that no one seems to know about the 3DS is that it's constantly having really good sales on the eShop. I mean, there's really not all that much at the time of this recording to be honest, but I'm telling you, if you have a 3DS, you should check the sales section every few weeks or so and you'll see some really good deals. Again, not as good as the Switch, but I think you'd be surprised. And while the Switch definitely has assloads of games from previous generations, the 3DS definitely has a lot of that as well, along with being backwards compatible with all the original DS games. Well, I mean, aside from like 3 or 4 DSi exclusives that no one cares about anyway. But honestly, all this backwards compatibility on the 3DS is why I personally think it might be my favorite console of all time, because if you thought the 3DS had some hidden gems, then don't get me started about how many there are on the original DS. Plus, more so than most other retro consoles, the 3DS was made at a point where the graphics are good enough to where it doesn't feel dated just yet. And that means that it has great games in 2D as well as 3D, which would be weird if it didn't, seeing as how 3D's in the console's friggin' name after all. And look, I'm definitely not saying that the graphics compare to other consoles on the market right now, but I am saying that there's plenty of great 3D games on here that'd be completely acceptable on any platform. Especially if you have the aforementioned new model as opposed to the original one, which is all they're selling these days anyway, at a lower cost than ever, mind you. And like I said earlier, I think that's all the more reason to buy one now while you still can before the prices skyrocket. And if you don't believe me, then go ahead and look at how much all the old regular 2DS models are going for these days, even though they can't play a sizable amount of the library. So if you plan on playing 3DS or even original DS games at some point, whether it be now or in the future, then 2020 could be your last chance to ever get a console that isn't used. And given how awesome the 3DS is, I'd say that's why over 600,000 people bought one in 2019. But anyway, what do you think about the 3DS right now? Do you still appreciate the old timer for all the great games it provided in the past? Do you still play it today? Or do you just wish the friggin' thing would die already? Either way, vote in the poll, let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, I'll try my goddamnedest to respond to everybody. But let me tell you, if there's 2 people who are even better handheld gaming devices than the 3DS, then it would definitely be today's patrons of the day, Ninja Robot and Alejandro Tamez. If you want to be badasses like these two, then consider supporting FU Game Crew on Patreon for loot boxes and all kinds of wacky rewards in the mail. And if you want to make cameos, then send pictures or videos of you rocking any FU Game Crew merch doing whatever you want as long as YouTube allows it, like these badasses you see before you. And as always, like and share this video if you want to help this channel grow, and if you want to prove that you're not down with registered sex offenders, then go right ahead and press that subscribe button if you haven't already. Also, I'm going to be streaming on Twitch at Cameron All One Word whenever I play games from now on, so feel free to come hang out and heckle me sometime. My name's Cameron All One Word, and I'll be back with more videos soon.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.